The earth holds secrets in places where human footsteps are forbidden, where warning signs mark the boundary between the known world and territories that promise only death, disease, or devastation to those who dare cross the threshold. These are not the imagined wastelands of fiction, but real coordinates on our maps, places where governments have drawn lines and said with absolute certainty that no one may enter. Behind every restriction lies a story of tragedy, danger, or sacred protection that demands the world remain at a distance. This is the chronicle of those forbidden places, the incidents that sealed them off, and the people who discovered, often at the cost of their lives, why some boundaries must never be crossed. The morning of November 15, 2018, began like any other in the waters surrounding the Andaman Islands. Fishermen prepared their boats in Port Blair, the capital of this remote Indian territory in the Bay of Bengal. Among the familiar faces was an unfamiliar one. A young American man with an athletic build and an eager expression, his skin tanned from weeks of tropical sun. His name was John Allen Chow, and he had spent nearly a decade preparing for what would become his final journey. Chow had arrived in the Andaman Islands in October, carrying with him a carefully assembled kit of supplies, picture cards for communication, medical equipment, gifts wrapped in plastic, and a well-worn Bible. He stayed at the Hotel Lalaji Bayview, where manager Nirwan Lal remembered him as a thoughtful guest who left behind a calendar featuring his own photographs as a gift. But Lal, like everyone else in Port Blair, had no idea what Cho was planning. Somewhere in those warm turquoise waters, approximately 50 kilometres from Port Blair, sits North Sentinel Island. From the air, it appears as a perfect jewel of tropical wilderness, ringed by coral reefs and covered in dense forest. The Sentinelese people have lived there for an estimated 60,000 years, making them one of the last uncontacted tribes on Earth. They have made their wishes regarding visitors absolutely clear across the centuries. Outsiders are not welcome, and those who approach do so at their own peril. The Indian government understood this long ago. Under the Andaman and Nicobar Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes regulation of 1956, it became illegal to approach within 5 kilometres of North Sentinel Island. The law existed not merely to protect curious visitors from the Sentinelese arrows, but to protect the Sentinelese themselves from the diseases that outsiders carried, infections against which the isolated tribe had no immunity. A single common cold, harmless to the modern world, could devastate their entire population. John Allen Chow knew all of this. He had studied the island obsessively since his high school years in Vancouver, Washington, where he grew up reading adventure books like Robinson Crusoe and dreaming of unexplored places. At Oral Roberts University, he managed the soccer team while quietly nurturing what he called his burden, the conviction that he had been chosen by God to bring Christianity to the Sentinelese. In his journals, he described North Sentinel as Satan's last stronghold on Earth. In 2017, Cha underwent training at a boot camp run by All Nations International, a Kansas City evangelical organization. The training included navigating a mock village, populated by staff members pretending to be hostile natives wielding fake spears. He learned basic linguistics, wilderness survival, and emergency medical care. He was vaccinated against every tropical disease his doctors could anticipate. He was quarantined to ensure he carried no infections. By any measure he could control, John Allen Chow prepared himself for contact with an isolated people who had rejected every attempt at communication for thousands of years. What he could not prepare for was the Sentinelese themselves. On November the 15th, Cho paid local fishermen to take him near the island, under cover of darkness, evading the Coast Guard patrols that protected the exclusion zone. He approached the island in a small kayak, carrying his Bible, his gifts, and his faith. The Sentinelese spotted him immediately. They strung their bows. Chow retreated, but he did not give up. The next day he returned, this time attempting to sing worship songs to the gathered tribespeople. They seemed curious at first, perhaps even amused by this strange singing man. He offered gifts of fish. A young boy with a bow and arrow approached him. When Chow held out his Bible, the boy shot an arrow directly into it. "My name is John, I love you, and Jesus loves you," Chow shouted as he fled back to his kayak. That night, by the light of a small flashlight on the fishing boat, John Allen Chow wrote what would be his final journal entries. He knew the danger he faced. "You guys might think I'm crazy in all this," he wrote to his family, "but I think it's worth it to declare Jesus to these people." He instructed the fishermen that if he did not return, they should not blame themselves. On the morning of November 17, 2018, Chow paddled toward North Sentinel Island for the last time. The fishermen watched from a distance as their passenger's kayak grew smaller against the green wall of jungle. They saw the Sentinelese emerge from the trees. They saw Chow walk onto the beach. They never saw him alive again. The next morning, the fishermen returned to their observation point. On the beach, they could see the Sentinelese dragging a body. Later that day, they watched the tribespeople digging in the sand, burying the remains of John Allen Chow in a shallow grave on the shore of the island he had dreamed of reaching for nearly a decade. His body was never recovered. The Indian government attempted several recovery missions, but each time the Sentinelese appeared on the beach with their bows drawn. Dipendra Pathak, the Director General of Police in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, eventually concluded that the risk of violent confrontation made further attempts impossible. John Allen Chow remains buried on North Sentinel Island to this day, a permanent resident of the place he believed was Satan's stronghold, guarded forever by the people he hoped to save. The Sentinelese were not always so isolated. Anthropological records suggest that in the 19th century, British colonial officer Maurice Vidal Portman led expeditions to the island, on one occasion kidnapping an elderly couple and several children to bring back to Port Blair. The elderly couple quickly died from disease, likely from the simple exposure to outside germs. The children, equally sick, were returned to the island with British gifts. Whatever happened next, whatever the surviving Sentinelese learned about the outside world from that encounter, sealed their attitude toward strangers forever. In 1974, a National Geographic film crew attempted to make contact. The Sentinelese greeted them with a barrage of arrows, one of which struck the documentary director in the thigh. In 2006, two fishermen named Sundar Raj and Pandit Tiwari were illegally harvesting crabs near the island when their anchor came loose and their boat drifted into the shallows. The Sentinelese killed them both with axes. Their bodies were buried on the beach, and when a Coast Guard helicopter attempted to recover the remains, tribespeople emerged to shoot arrows at the aircraft. North Sentinel Island remains one of the most forbidden places on Earth, protected by a combination of international law, Indian government policy, and the determination of a people who have survived 60,000 years by keeping the outside world at a distance. The boundary they enforce is deadly, but it is also, in its way, a form of self-preservation that the modern world has learned to respect. Across the planet, in the warm waters of the South Atlantic, another island earned its forbidden status not through human defenders, but through creatures far more numerous and infinitely more lethal. Ilha da Queimada Grande rises from the ocean approximately 90 miles off the coast of Sao Paulo, Brazil. To the untrained eye, it appears as an inviting slice of tropical paradise, with rocky shores giving way to lush vegetation and a temperate climate that would make it ideal for tourism. It is approximately 430,000 square meters of prime coastal real estate, blessed with rainforest, varied terrain, and stunning ocean views. It is also home to between 2,000 and 4,000 golden lancehead pit vipers, one of the most venomous snakes in the world, concentrated in such density that by some estimates there is one snake for every square meter of land. The golden lancehead, known scientifically as Bothrops insularis, exists nowhere else on Earth. Approximately 11,000 years ago, when the last ice age ended and sea levels rose, the land bridge connecting Queimada Grande to the mainland, the snakes that lived on what had been a peninsula found themselves trapped on a rapidly shrinking island, with no ground-level prey and no ground-level predators. Evolution, faced with this unusual challenge, produced an equally unusual solution. The golden lanceheads adapted to hunt the migratory birds that visited the island seasonally, developing venom 5 times more potent than their mainland relatives. Where a typical lancehead bite gives its victim time to seek medical attention, the golden lancehead's venom works with terrifying speed, causing rapid hemorrhaging, kidney failure, necrosis of muscular tissue, and brain bleeding. Without immediate treatment, death can occur within an hour. With treatment, the mortality rate still hovers around 3%. The Brazilian Navy banned all civilian access to Snake Island in the 1920s after a series of incidents that passed into local legend. The details vary with each telling, but the stories share common elements. Lighthouse keepers assigned to maintain the island's navigation beacon, families who tried to make homes among the deadly serpents, deaths that came swiftly and horribly. The most famous legend concerns the last lighthouse keeper and his family. According to the story passed down through generations of fishermen in the coastal towns near Queimada Grande, the family was asleep one night when snakes began slithering through their open windows. The keeper, his wife, and their 3 children fled towards their boat, running through vegetation where more lanceheads hung from branches overhead. One by one, they were bitten. One by one they fell. The lighthouse was automated shortly after, and no permanent human presence has existed on the island since. Another story tells of a fisherman who wandered onto the island to pick bananas, unaware of the danger. He was found days later by other fishermen, adrift in his boat, dead in a pool of his own blood, his body bearing multiple lancehead bites. While these stories cannot be verified, what is certain is that the Brazilian Navy takes the danger seriously enough to maintain strict control over all access. The only people permitted on Snake Island today are researchers with special authorization from ICMBio, the Chico Mendes Institute of Biodiversity Conservation. Even these qualified scientists must bring a doctor with them at all times, prepared to administer antivenom at a moment's notice. The danger has not stopped everyone. In 2023, a YouTube personality known as Lord Miles evaded Brazilian authorities to land on the island, wearing body armor to protect himself from bites. The stunt, while generating millions of views, represented exactly the kind of recklessness that Brazilian law is designed to prevent. The irony of Snake Island is that the restrictions exist not only to protect humans, but to protect the snakes themselves. The golden lancehead is critically endangered, its entire population confined to this single small island. Biopirates, illegal wildlife traffickers, have been known to attempt landings to capture specimens for the black market, where a single golden lancehead can fetch between $10,000 and $30,000 from collectors or researchers willing to bypass legal channels. The snake's venom, for all its lethality, has shown potential in pharmaceutical research. Scientists studying the golden lancehead have found compounds that may help treat heart disease, blood clots, and circulation problems. The same properties that make the venom so deadly make it potentially valuable for saving lives in controlled medical applications. But for the average person, for the tourist who might see a beautiful island on the horizon and think it looks like paradise, Snake Island remains what it has been for a century, a place where the boundary between life and death is measured in the distance between human skin and serpent fangs. On the morning of April 26, 1986, the residents of Pripyat, Ukraine, woke to an ordinary Saturday. The city of nearly 50,000 people had been built specifically to house workers at the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and its wide boulevards, modern apartments, and abundant recreational facilities represented the best of Soviet urban planning. Children played in schoolyards, families prepared for weekend outings. No one knew that 12 hours earlier, at 1:23 in the morning, reactor number 4 had exploded. The operators had been conducting a safety test, attempting to determine how long the reactor's turbines would spin in the event of a power outage, generating enough electricity to keep coolant pumps running until emergency diesel generators could start. It was a routine procedure that had been delayed multiple times. When they finally ran the test, a combination of design flaws in the RBMK reactor type and critical errors by the operating staff caused a catastrophic power surge that blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid off the building and exposed the nuclear core to the open air. The graphite moderator caught fire. Radioactive material began pouring into the atmosphere. Within minutes, firefighters arrived on the scene. unaware of the nature of what they were fighting. They had been trained to extinguish ordinary fires. The flames they encountered that night glowed blue and green from radiation. The heat they felt came not just from combustion, but from nuclear fission itself. Many of them picked up pieces of graphite from the ground, not knowing they were handling fragments of the reactor core that would deliver lethal doses of radiation in seconds. Valery Kodymchuk, a pump operator, died immediately in the explosion. His body never recovered from the rubble. Vladimir Shashanok, an automatic systems adjuster, sustained severe steam burns and radiation exposure. He died in the hospital later that morning. Over the following days and weeks, 28 more workers and firefighters would die from acute radiation syndrome, their bodies breaking down at the cellular level from radiation doses measured in the hundreds of sieverts, thousands of times the annual exposure limit for nuclear workers. For 36 hours, the Soviet government said nothing to the people of Pripyat. Children continued to play outside, breathing air contaminated with radioactive iodine, cesium, and strontium. Families hung their laundry to dry, where radioactive particles settled into the fabric. On the rooftops of apartment buildings, residents gathered to watch the strange glow emanating from the damaged reactor, unaware they were witnessing one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. It was not until radiation alarms began sounding at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, more than 1,000 kilometers away, that the world learned something catastrophic had occurred in the Soviet Union. Swedish workers arriving for their shifts triggered the alarms, their clothing contaminated by radioactive fallout that had drifted across Europe on the prevailing winds. On April 27th, Soviet authorities finally ordered the evacuation of Pripyat. Residents were told they would be leaving for only 3 days. They left behind their possessions, their pets, their lives. Most would never return. The Chernobyl exclusion zone, established in the immediate aftermath, initially covered a 30-kilometer radius around the destroyed reactor. Over time, as updated contamination maps were produced, the zone expanded to cover approximately 2,600 square kilometers. Within this area, 187 communities were abandoned, their populations scattered across the Soviet Union, and, after 1991, the newly independent states of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The cleanup effort, known as liquidation, would eventually involve more than 500,000 people. They called themselves liquidators, a grimly appropriate term for workers tasked with eliminating the consequences of the disaster. Some were professionals, nuclear engineers and scientists who understood the risks they faced. Many were soldiers, young conscripts ordered to shovel radioactive graphite from the roof of Reactor 3, where chunks of the destroyed reactor core had landed. They called these men biorobots because actual robots failed in the intense radiation, their circuits destroyed by the same particles that would later destroy human cells. The liquidators worked in shifts measured in seconds. 40 seconds was the maximum time a human could spend on the roof before receiving a lifetime dose of radiation. They would run out, shovel a few pieces of debris, and run back. Then the next group would go. Across thousands of such sorties, they cleared the roof and prepared the site for the construction of a massive concrete sarcophagus designed to contain the radioactive remains. Among the most haunting discoveries in the ruins was what came to be known as the Elephant's Foot, a mass of molten concrete, sand, and nuclear fuel that had flowed into the basement of Reactor 4 during the meltdown. When researchers first found it in December 1986, using remote cameras lowered through holes drilled in the structure, the elephant's foot was so radioactive that spending 5 minutes in its presence would cause death within 2 days. Even today, decades later, it remains one of the most radioactive objects in the world. The human cost of Chernobyl remains disputed. The immediate death toll of approximately 30 is not controversial, but the long-term effects, the cancers, the genetic damage, the shortened lives of liquidators and evacuees, these numbers vary wildly depending on the methodology used to calculate them. The UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation estimates fewer than 100 deaths directly attributable to the disaster. Other studies, including a controversial 2006 report that analysed Eastern European health data, suggest the number could be in the tens of thousands or higher. What is not disputed is that the Chernobyl exclusion zone remains one of the most forbidden places on Earth. While limited tourism was permitted before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and approximately 350,000 visitors toured the zone between 2017 and 2022, access to the most contaminated areas remains strictly prohibited. The Red Forest, named for the colour the pine trees turned before dying from radiation exposure, was bulldozed and buried by liquidators, but remains dangerous decades later. Certain hotspots within the zone will remain uninhabitable for thousands of years. The zone has become, paradoxically, a wildlife sanctuary. Freed from human activity, populations of wolves, wild boar, European bison, lynx and eagles have flourished. Scientists studying the area have found that while radiation has caused increased rates of cataracts, albinism, and other abnormalities in wildlife, the absence of humans has been a net positive for animal populations. There are now 7 times more wolves in the exclusion zone than in comparable nature reserves elsewhere. A small number of people, mostly elderly, have returned to their homes within the zone. They are called Samosely, self-settlers, and the Ukrainian government has reluctantly tolerated their presence while warning that they accept all risks. Their numbers dwindle each year, from an estimated 1,200 in 1986 to fewer than 200 today, their average age over 60. When the last of them dies, Chernobyl will be entirely a land of ghosts, a monument to human error preserved in radiation for millennia to come. In the Venetian lagoon between the glittering city of Venice and the Italian mainland sits a small cluster of islands that most Venetians refuse to approach. Poveglia, covering approximately 18 acres, appears peaceful from a distance, its crumbling buildings half hidden by overgrown vegetation, its bell tower standing silent against the Adriatic sky. The island's history, however, is anything but peaceful. The human presence on Poveglia dates to the 5th century, when refugees fleeing barbarian invasions found sanctuary on its shores. For centuries, it was a small but prosperous community, its residents fishing the lagoon and trading salt with nearby settlements. Then came the Black Death. The plague first swept through Venice in 1348, killing an estimated 60% of the population. The Venetian authorities, desperate to control the spread of disease, established Poveglia as a lazaretto, a quarantine station where the sick and the dying would be isolated from the healthy. Anyone showing symptoms of plague was transported to the island. So were the dead. The scale of death on Poveglia during the various plague outbreaks that struck Venice over the following centuries is difficult to comprehend. Conservative estimates suggest that more than 100,000 people died on the island. Other sources claim the number could exceed 160,000. Mass graves, called plague pits, were dug and filled with bodies. When the pits overflowed, the corpses were burned. Local legends claim that the soil of Poveglia is now 50% human ash, though this figure is almost certainly an exaggeration. The plague eventually subsided, but Poveglia's dark history was far from over. In 1922, the Italian government converted the island's buildings into a psychiatric hospital. Mental illness in the early 20th century was poorly understood, and treatment options were barbaric by modern standards. Patients at Poveglia were subjected to electroshock therapy, experimental lobotomies, and physical restraints that would be considered torture today. Local legend speaks of a doctor who worked at the hospital, a man whose cruelty became infamous even by the standards of the era. According to the stories, this doctor conducted sadistic experiments on his patients, performing lobotomies and other procedures with no anesthetic, driven by curiosity rather than any desire to heal. The patients, already suffering from mental illness, reported seeing the ghosts of plague victims wandering the hospital corridors. Eventually, the story goes, the doctor went mad himself. He climbed to the top of the hospital's bell tower and threw himself off. Some versions of the legend claim that the fall did not kill him immediately, that he lay injured at the base of the tower until a mysterious fog rolled in and finished what the fall had started. Whether any of this is true remains uncertain. What is certain is that the psychiatric hospital closed in 1968, and Poveglia has been abandoned ever since. The Italian government has declared the island off-limits to visitors, officially citing the dangerous condition of the decaying structures. The floors are rotting, the walls are unstable, and exploring the ruins without proper equipment and expertise could easily result in injury or death. Restoration crews who attempted to work on the island reportedly left abruptly, though whether from supernatural encounters or the simple difficulty of the work remains a matter of speculation. In 2014, the Italian government auctioned a 99-year lease on Poveglia, hoping that a private developer would transform the island into a hotel or other tourist attraction. An Italian businessman named Luigi Brainaro won the auction with a bid of €513,000, but the deal was eventually annulled. Some sources suggest the bid was too low, others hint at other reasons. In August 2025, a grassroots organisation called Poveglia per Tutti, Poveglia for All, received a 6-year concession for the northern part of the island to implement their vision of an urban lagoon park. Whether their plans will succeed where others have failed remains to be seen. For now, Poveglia remains what it has been for decades, a forbidden island where the living are not welcome, perhaps because the dead are not yet finished with it. Deep in the Dordogne region of southwestern France, near the village of Montignac, a hillside conceals one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements and one of archaeology's most frustrating preservation challenges. The Lascaux Cave, discovered by accident on September 12, 1940, contains approximately 6,000 painted figures dating back 17,000 years, making it one of the most significant prehistoric sites ever found. The discovery came, as many great discoveries do, through a combination of accident and curiosity. A local teenager named Marcel Ravitat was walking in the woods when he noticed a hole in the ground, left by an uprooted tree. Some versions of the story claim that Ravitat's dog, Robot, fell into the hole while chasing a rabbit. Other versions suggest Ravitat simply found the opening and grew curious about what lay beneath. On September 12th, Ravitat returned to the site with 3 friends, Jacques Marsal, Georges Agnel, and Simon Concas. The 4 teenagers, aged between 15 and 18, had heard local legends about a secret tunnel connecting the Vézère River to the nearby Château de Montignac. They hoped they had found the entrance to buried treasure. What they found was infinitely more valuable. After dropping down through a 15-metre shaft, the boys emerged into a vast underground gallery. By the dim light of their oil lamp, they saw walls covered in paintings of animals, larger than life, seemingly in motion. Horses galloped across limestone surfaces, bulls charged through eternal twilight, deer, bison and wild cats populated a menagerie frozen in time since the Upper Paleolithic period. Ravitat later recalled the moment of discovery with wonder. We could see a cavalcade of animals, larger than life, painted on the walls and ceiling of the cave. Each animal seemed to be moving. The boys reported their find to their teacher, and within days the academic world descended on Montignac. The Abbé Henri Breul, one of the foremost experts on prehistoric cave art, arrived on September 21st and began making sketches that would form the basis of scholarly study for decades. The cave was classified as a historic monument before the year was out. After World War II, Lascaux was open to the public. Visitors came by the hundreds, then by the thousands, then by the hundreds of thousands. By the mid-1950s, more than 1,200 people were passing through the cave every single day, their breath filling the enclosed space with carbon dioxide and water vapor, their bodies generating heat that altered the cave's delicate climate. The consequences were not immediately apparent, but they were inevitable. The paintings that had survived 17 millennia of isolation began to deteriorate within 2 decades of exposure to human visitors. Green algae appeared on the walls, feeding on the light from artificial lamps installed to let tourists see the artwork. White crystals formed where moisture condensed on the limestone. The vivid colours that had survived since the last ice age began to fade. In 1963, André Malraux, the French Minister of Culture, made the difficult decision to close Lascaux to the public. The cave that had welcomed hundreds of thousands of visitors would now admit only a handful of scientists, and even they would be subject to strict protocols designed to minimize human impact on the fragile environment. Today, access to the original Lascaux cave is among the most restricted in the world. Visitors must wear sterile white overalls, latex gloves, and shoe covers. They may illuminate their work only with the faint glow of LED headlamps. They may stay for minutes at a time, not hours. Every breath they take, every microscopic particle they shed, represents a potential threat to artwork that has survived for longer than human civilization has existed. The battle to save Lascaux continues. In 2001, a new air conditioning system was installed to better regulate temperature and humidity. Within months, a white mold called Fusarium solani appeared on the walls and ceiling, spreading rapidly across surfaces that had resisted biological invasion for millennia. The mold was eventually controlled with quicklime treatments, but in 2007 a new fungus appeared, creating grey and black blemishes that have proven even more difficult to eradicate. In January 2008, authorities closed the cave entirely for 3 months, allowing only a single individual to enter for 20 minutes once a week to monitor conditions. The same paintings that once drew crowds from around the world now exist in near total darkness, visited only by scientists who are themselves contributing to the artwork's slow decline simply by being present. For the public, Lascaux now exists only in replica. Lascaux 2, opened in 1983, reproduces approximately 80% of the original cave with painstaking accuracy. Lascaux IV, opened in 2016, provides an even more complete experience, including changes in air pressure and atmospheric sense, designed to simulate the original cave environment. The reproductions draw approximately 250,000 visitors per year, allowing people to experience the wonder of Paleolithic art without further endangering the real thing. But the original Lascaux, the actual walls where Paleolithic artists worked by the light of animal fat lamps 17,000 years ago, remains forbidden. It is a place where human presence has been recognized as incompatible with preservation, where the boundary between visitor and artwork has been redrawn in favor of the art. The teenagers who discovered Lascaux in 1940 unleashed something magnificent into the world, but the world proved too much for it to bear. In the remote Nevada desert, approximately 83 miles north-northwest of Las Vegas, a dusty, unmarked road leads to a chain-link fence, a boom gate, and signs that leave no room for interpretation. Photography is prohibited. Use of deadly force is authorized. Beyond that fence lies Area 51, perhaps the most famous forbidden place in the United States, a military installation so shrouded in secrecy that the government did not officially acknowledge its existence until 2013. The story of Area 51 begins in the early 1950s, during the coldest years of the Cold War. American intelligence agencies desperately needed to monitor Soviet military capabilities, but reconnaissance aircraft of the era flew too low, making them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. The CIA commissioned the development of a new spy plane, one that could fly so high that Soviet defenses could not touch it. The result was the U-2, a single-seat reconnaissance aircraft capable of reaching altitudes above 70,000 feet. But developing such a revolutionary aircraft required a remote, secure location where test flights could be conducted without detection. In 1955, CIA officials and Lockheed engineers identified a dry lake bed in southern Nevada, part of the Nevada test site used for nuclear weapons testing. The area was already restricted, already remote, already protected by military security. The base became known as Area 51, its designation on old Atomic Energy Commission maps. To convince civilian workers to relocate to such an isolated location, Lockheed engineer Kelly Johnson gave it a more appealing name, Paradise Ranch. The first U-2 arrived at Paradise Ranch on July 24, 1955, transported from Lockheed's facilities in Burbank, California. Testing began almost immediately, and almost immediately strange reports began filtering back to Washington from ordinary Americans who had seen something impossible in the sky. The U-2 flew higher than any aircraft the public knew existed. When airline pilots or civilians on the ground spotted one, they saw a metallic object glinting in the sunlight at altitudes where no human-made craft was supposed to operate. The Air Force established Project Blue Book specifically to investigate these UFO reports, comparing witness descriptions against classified CIA flight logs. In nearly every case, the unidentified flying objects matched U-2 flights. The government could not simply tell the American public that they were testing a secret spy plane, so they told them they were seeing weather phenomena. The official explanation satisfied no one, and the mysteries of Area 51 were born. Over the decades that followed, Area 51 became the testing ground for some of the most advanced aircraft in history. The A-12 and SR-71 Blackbird reconnaissance jets, capable of speeds exceeding 3 times the speed of sound, were developed there. The F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth aircraft, underwent testing at the base before becoming operational in 1983. Each new aircraft flying at impossible speeds or appearing invisible to radar generated new waves of UFO reports. The conspiracy theories that now define Area 51 in popular imagination began in earnest in 1989, when a man named Bob Lazar appeared on KLAS-TV in Las Vegas, claiming to have worked at a facility near Area 51, called S4. According to Lazar, the government was reverse engineering recovered alien spacecraft, studying propulsion systems that defied known physics. Lazar described underground laboratories connected to Area 51 by vast rail tunnels, alien technology stored in hangars carved into mountainsides. No evidence has ever supported Lazar's claims. Records of his educational background and employment history do not match his assertions. Scientists who have examined his descriptions of alien propulsion systems have found them inconsistent with physics, but Lazar's interview captured the public imagination in a way that facts have never been able to dispel. Today, Area 51 remains an active military installation. The base and its runway system have expanded significantly since the 1950s, with massive new hangars visible in satellite imagery. An estimated 1,500 workers are shuttled to the facility daily on Janet Airlines, a classified airline that operates unmarked aircraft from Harry Reid International Airport in Las Vegas. What happens inside remains, for the most part, unknown. Researchers speculate that the base is used for developing advanced stealth technology, unmanned aerial vehicles, electronic warfare systems, and other classified projects. The government neither confirms nor denies these speculations. What the government has acknowledged as of 2013 is simply that Area 51 exists and has been used for testing reconnaissance aircraft. The boundaries around Area 51 are enforced with extreme seriousness. Motion sensors buried in the desert detect any approach. Security cameras monitor the surrounding terrain. Armed guards patrol the perimeter with authorization to use deadly force against trespassers. Military pilots training in the nearby Nevada Test and Training Range risk disciplinary action if they stray into the restricted airspace. In September 2019, a Facebook event called Storm Area 51 They Can't Stop All of Us proposed that millions of people converge on the base and charge the gates together. The Air Force issued stern warnings. Local authorities prepared for the worst. In the end, approximately 1,500 people traveled to the Nevada desert for what became a largely peaceful alien-themed festival. About 40 approached the outer perimeter before dispersing when confronted by law enforcement. One arrest was made for public urination. Area 51 remains what it has always been, a place where the US develops technology it does not want the world to know about, protected by layers of secrecy, security, and the persistent human tendency to fill the unknown with imagination. Far from the conspiracy theories of Nevada, in the frozen reaches of the Arctic Circle, another kind of forbidden place guards a different kind of secret. On the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen, part of the Svalbard archipelago, a concrete wedge juts from a mountainside, its entrance facing the perpetual twilight of the polar winter. This is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and what it protects may be more important than anything hidden at Area 51. The vault, which opened on February 26, 2008, represents humanity's insurance policy against agricultural catastrophe. Buried more than 100 meters inside a sandstone mountain, maintained at temperatures of -18 degrees Celsius, it contains duplicate samples of seeds from crop collections around the world. As of today, the vault holds more than 3 million seed samples from practically every country on Earth, representing the genetic diversity of humanity's food supply. The idea for such a facility originated in the 1980s with conservationist Carrie Fowler, who recognized a troubling vulnerability in global agriculture. Seed banks, or gene banks, exist in most countries, preserving the genetic diversity of important crops. But these facilities are vulnerable to exactly the kinds of disasters they were created to protect against: war, civil unrest, natural catastrophes, equipment failures, funding cuts. Any of these could destroy irreplaceable genetic material. The examples were not theoretical. The National Gene Bank of the Philippines was damaged by flooding and later destroyed by fire. The gene banks of Afghanistan and Iraq were lost entirely during decades of conflict. An international gene bank in Syria became inaccessible after civil war engulfed the country, demonstrating that even facilities backed by global institutions could fall victim to human violence. Svalbard was chosen for the Global Seed Vault for reasons both practical. The location offers extreme remoteness, being the farthest north one can travel on a scheduled commercial flight. It provides natural cold storage in the permafrost but surrounds the facility. The sandstone mountain is geologically stable with no significant seismic activity. The vault sits more than 130 meters above sea level, high enough to survive even worst-case projections of sea level rise from climate change. The Norwegian government funded the vault's construction, which cost approximately 45 million Norwegian kroner, about $9 million US. At the time, ongoing operations are funded jointly by Norway and the Crop Trust, an independent international organization dedicated to preserving crop diversity. Access to the vault is among the most restricted of any facility on Earth. There are no permanent staff on site. The vault opens only a few times a year, primarily to receive new seed deposits. When it does open, only authorized personnel from Nordgen, the Nordic Genetic Resource Center that operates the facility, may enter. Stringent quarantine measures ensure that no pathogens, no insects, no contaminants of any kind accompany the seeds into their frozen sanctuary. The restrictions exist not because of what humans might steal, but because of what they might destroy. The seeds stored in Svalbard belong to the countries and institutions that deposited them. They remain the legal property of the depositors, stored under black box, conditions that prevent anyone, including Nordgen staff, from accessing seeds that do not belong to them. The vault is simply a backup, a safeguard against catastrophe. In 2015, that safeguard proved its worth. The International Center for Agricultural Research in the Dry Areas, known as ICARDA, had maintained one of the world's most important gene banks in Aleppo, Syria. When the Syrian civil war made the facility inaccessible, ICARDA requested the return of seeds it had deposited at Svalbard. The vault opened, the seeds were withdrawn, and ICARDA used them to establish new gene banks in Morocco and Lebanon. It was the first and, so far, only withdrawal from the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. In a facility designed for doomsday, Syria's destruction provided a smaller-scale test that the system passed. The vault's design anticipates a future in which everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. If the power fails, the permafrost will keep the seeds frozen. If the permafrost melts due to climate change, the vault's position deep inside the mountain will maintain adequate cold. If nuclear war devastates civilization, the seeds will survive for generations, waiting for whoever emerges from the rubble to begin rebuilding agriculture. Tourists cannot enter the vault, but they can visit the exterior, joining guided tours that travel to within sight of its distinctive entrance. Some have called it the most hopeful structure on Earth, a monument to international cooperation in an age of division, a commitment to the future embedded in Arctic ice. But the hope it represents comes with a sobering reality. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault exists because humanity has recognized the fragility of its food systems, the possibility of catastrophes that could destroy centuries of agricultural development. The seeds frozen in that mountain represent both the diversity we have preserved and the diversity we continue to lose, the countless varieties of crops that disappear each year as industrial agriculture replaces traditional farming. The boundary that surrounds Svalbard is not enforced by armed guards or motion sensors. It is enforced by climate, by geography, by the understanding that what lies within must remain undisturbed until the day it is desperately needed, and by then, those who need it may be the only humans left. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, known until 2019 as the Vatican Secret Archive, occupies approximately 85 kilometers of shelving beneath Vatican City. Within its climate-controlled warehouses and underground vaults rest documents spanning 12 centuries of papal history, from letters by medieval monarchs to records of the Inquisition, from communications with Napoleon to the proceedings against Galileo. The name Secret led generations of conspiracy theorists to imagine forbidden knowledge hidden beneath St. Peter's Basilica. In truth, the Latin term secretum simply means private or personal, referring to the archive's status as the personal property of the Pope rather than any particular church institution. Pope Francis changed the name in 2019 specifically to distance the archive from its mysterious reputation. Yet the Vatican Apostolic Archive remains, in practical terms, highly restricted. Access is granted only to qualified scholars with specialized degrees, institutional backing, and demonstrated research purposes. Applicants must provide letters of recommendation, detailed research proposals, and proof of their credentials. Even successful applicants may view only a limited number of documents per day, requested in advance and delivered by staff who retrieve items from the vast underground stacks. Materials created after 1922 remain entirely sealed, with access granted no earlier than 75 years after the close of a pope's reign. Certain documents, including the private records of church figures after 1922, remain classified in the modern sense of the word, actively denied to all researchers regardless of their credentials. The archive contains genuine treasures of historical importance. The 1521 papal bull excommunicating Martin Luther, the document that sparked the Protestant Reformation, rests in the collection. So does a letter from Mary, Queen of Scots, written while she awaited her execution. The minutes of the trials against the Knights Templar, the records of Galileo's prosecution for heresy, diplomatic correspondence with emperors and kings, all exist within the Vatican's carefully preserved documents. The mysteries of the Vatican archive are not supernatural. They are simply the mysteries of any vast collection accumulated over centuries, containing documents that no researcher has yet examined, correspondence that could reshape understanding of historical events, records that may support or contradict the official histories of nations and institutions. The restriction on access exists partly to protect fragile materials, partly to maintain diplomatic and personal confidentiality, and partly because the archive serves the Pope's interests first and scholarship second. For those outside the scholarly elite, the Vatican's archive remains forbidden. The documents that could illuminate medieval politics, Renaissance art, or Cold War diplomacy sit in temperature-controlled darkness, waiting for the researchers who may or may not receive permission to examine them. These places, scattered across the globe, share a common quality beyond their forbidden status. Each represents a boundary that humanity has drawn around itself, a limit beyond which we acknowledge our presence does more harm than good. North Sentinel Island protects a people who have chosen isolation, whose survival depends on remaining apart from a world that carries diseases they cannot resist. Snake Island protects creatures so deadly that their habitat can only be preserved by keeping humans at a permanent distance. Chernobyl protects the world from radiation that will remain dangerous for longer than civilizations typically last. Pavaglia protects visitors from structures that have become as deadly as the diseases that once filled them. Glasgow protects art from the very people who come to admire it. Area 51 protects secrets that governments believe are worth killing to keep. The Svalbard Vault protects seeds that may one day be all that remains of agricultural abundance. The stories of those who crossed these boundaries, whether through courage, ignorance or desperation, remind us why the boundaries exist. John Allen Shaw lies buried on a beach where no one will ever visit his grave. The lighthouse keepers of Snake Island left only legends of their fate. The firefighters of Chernobyl sacrificed their lives fighting a fire they did not understand. The patients of Poveglia suffered in isolation until isolation itself became the island's character. The teenagers who discovered Lascaux triggered a chain of events that would ultimately seal their discovery away. Humanity explores. It is perhaps our defining characteristic, the impulse that drove us out of Africa to colonize every continent, that sent ships across oceans and rockets beyond our atmosphere. But exploration has limits, places where our presence brings only destruction, to ourselves or to what we find there. The deadly boundaries that guard these places are not obstacles to be overcome. They are acknowledgements that some things in this world are more important than our desire to see them, touch them, understand them. They are lines drawn in respect for danger we cannot conquer, for peoples we cannot contact, for preservation we cannot achieve except through absence. Behind every warning sign, every armed guard, every international treaty prohibiting access, lies a story of why that boundary was drawn. Those stories collected here remind us that the Earth still holds places where humans are not meant to go, where our footsteps would leave marks that would never heal. The boundaries remain, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be.